In the year 1830, the village of Blackwood stood like a shadow carved into the wilderness. Hidden away between dense forests and winding rivers, it was a place untouched by modern bustle, where time seemed to move at its own weary pace. The people of Blackwood were simple, cautious folk who knew every face in their town and feared anything that lay beyond it. Outsiders rarely lingered, and the villagers rarely left. It was not just pride in their land that bound them there, but also a lingering unease, a superstition that whispered of curses and things better left undisturbed. At the heart of this village stood the Cunningham estate, a sprawling stone manor built generations earlier when the Cunningham family first laid claim to the fertile lands around Blackwood. By 1830, the estate had grown into something less like a home and more like a monument, looming over the town from its hilltop perch. Its tall windows caught no sunlight, its iron gates creaked but never opened, and its gardens, once the pride of the family, had grown wild with thorn and bramble, choking any trace of beauty. Two sisters lived inside that house now, the last of the Cunningham bloodline, Eleanor and Margaret. Eleanor, the elder by 3 years, was known for her piercing eyes and a composure so cold that even in church she seemed to freeze the air around her. Margaret, more delicate in appearance, carried a strange sadness in her features, as if haunted by something only she could see. They were rarely spotted in the town square, and when they were, the villagers would lower their voices, watching as the sisters moved together like pale spectres, silent and untouchable. The mystery surrounding them deepened after the sudden death of their parents. Mr. and Mrs. Cunningham were found lifeless in their bed one morning, their bodies strangely drained of colour, their skin as brittle as parchment. No doctor could explain the cause, and the sisters offered no answers. Instead, they closed the doors of the manor, dismissed the staff, and retreated into a silence so complete it unsettled the entire town. Days passed, then weeks. No sounds of life were heard from within the house, no laughter, no conversation, not even the clatter of footsteps on its stone floors. Only faint glimmers of candlelight in the upper windows betrayed that the sisters were still alive at all. Yet even that light seemed unnatural, flickering long past midnight, as though rituals of some secret kind were being carried out behind the heavy curtains. The villagers began to whisper. Children were warned never to wander near the Cunningham Hill. Farmers swore they heard cries echoing from the estate on windless nights, cries that were not human. Some claimed to see figures moving through the windows, more than just the sisters, though the house was meant to be empty. And so, in Blackwood, the Cunningham sisters became both legend and terror. They were the last heirs of a fading dynasty, but to the villagers, they were something far darker. Women who carried with them a deadly secret, one that had already claimed their parents, and if the whispers were true, would claim many more. After the deaths of their parents, the Cunningham sisters sealed themselves away inside the manor, as though the great house had swallowed them whole. Months passed, and still no servant returned to its halls, no guest was ever seen entering or leaving. The estate, once a centre of gatherings and proud displays of wealth, grew shrouded in decay. Ivy crawled up the walls unchecked, shutters cracked and clattered in the wind, and the iron gates rusted until their hinges groaned like dying men. Yet, somehow, the sisters inside seemed untouched by the rot that consumed their surroundings. To the people of Blackwood, it was not simply the house's disrepair that unsettled them. It was the silence. Other great homes had the sounds of life. Doors opening and closing, carriages arriving, children playing, or servants calling to one another. But at the Cunningham Manor, there was only absence. No sounds of daily existence ever reached beyond the gates. By day, the manor seemed abandoned. By night, however, thin streaks of candlelight glimmered from the upper rooms. The villagers came to believe the sisters never slept. This silence was not a peaceful one. It had weight, pressing upon anyone who wandered too close to the estate. Shepherds driving their flocks along the outer fields said their animals grew restless, refusing to graze near the boundary fence. Stray dogs barked and snarled when the manor came into sight, as though sensing something their masters could not. Children dared one another to run up the hill and touch the gates, but none stayed long, for the silence around the house was broken only by the beating of their own terrified hearts. It was during these long months that rumours took root. Some swore the sisters were no longer human at all, that their parents' deaths had been the result of some unholy inheritance. Others whispered that the two had fallen into, madness, driven to seclusion by grief and guilt. But a darker tale soon spread, that the sisters were practicing the very arts their ancestors had been accused of. Rituals whispered about in old church records but never proven. The silence of the manor fed these suspicions. Villagers said that on certain nights, when the moon was hidden and the air was unnaturally still, cries could be heard from within the Cunningham estate. They did not sound like cries of mourning or prayer, but of anguish, high-pitched wails that chilled the blood. Once, a miller's wife claimed she heard laughter mingled with the cries, a laughter sharp and echoing that could not have belonged to either Eleanor or Margaret. No one dared investigate. To speak too loudly about the sisters was to invite their gaze, and no one in Blackwood wanted to draw such attention. And so the townsfolk carried on their lives in uneasy quiet, pretending not to see the flickering lights or hear the strange sounds, all the while knowing something in that house was festering, growing stronger with every passing night. The Cunningham sisters had embraced silence, not as mourning, but as a shield. For within that silence, something unholy was taking shape. When Mr. and Mrs. Cunningham died, their fortune, land, titles, and the sprawling manor passed directly to Eleanor and Margaret. But along with coin and property came something less tangible, something hidden. Among the possessions sealed away in the upper library was a collection of journals and ledgers dating back to the family's earliest days in Blackwood. Most of the villagers knew the Cunninghams as proud landowners, wealthy through grain and trade. Yet buried in those dusty volumes was a record of something darker. References to the covenant, the offering, and the preservation. The journals describe rituals whispered in ink, the kind of writings one might mistake for superstition if not for the precision with which they were detailed. Measurements of blood, timings of the moon, instructions written as if meant to be passed from one generation to the next. These were not myths but manuals. Eleanor, sharp and unflinching, pored over them with a hunger that startled even her sister. Margaret, though hesitant, could not escape her sister's pull. Eleanor insisted that their family's wealth, influence, and longevity had never been built on trade alone. The Cunningham line had endured because it had fed on others. Every few years, a life was offered, and in exchange fortune and health remained in their bloodline. Their parents, Eleanor claimed, had failed to make the proper offering, and that was why death had taken them so suddenly, leaving their bodies pale and brittle. "They broke the covenant," she whispered, "and it devoured them." Margaret recoiled at the thought. She wanted to believe her sister was wrong, that grief had clouded Eleanor's mind. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Letters from ancestors describing how famine skipped their lands while neighboring villages starved. Portraits of forebears who seemed never to age beyond a certain point. And then there was the matter of the cellar. Their father had always kept its key close, never allowing even his daughters to enter. Now, that key hung heavy in Eleanor's hand. The inheritance then was not merely money and land. It was knowledge. Knowledge bound in blood. Eleanor saw it as a duty, a responsibility to preserve their line at any cost. Margaret saw it as a curse, yet one she could not escape, for the bond between sisters was strong, and Eleanor's will was stronger still. The sisters began to speak less of mourning and more of necessity. They would not follow their parents to an early grave. They would not let the Cunningham name fade. If the covenant demanded silence, secrecy, and sacrifice, then so be it. And so, the inheritance became a burden they both carried, wealth tainted by whispers, survival bought with blood. The villagers believed the sisters had retreated into grief, but in truth, the Cunningham estate had become something else entirely, a place where ancient words were spoken once more and where the cost of inheritance would soon be paid. At first, nothing seemed unusual. After their parents' deaths, the sisters quietly hired a handful of servants to maintain the estate. A cook, a stable boy, and 2 maids arrived, lured by the promise of good wages and a roof over their heads. For a short while, it appeared as though the Cunningham Manor might return to life, the clatter of work echoing faintly once more through its long-forgotten halls. But within weeks, Unease began to spread. The cook, an older woman named Hester, confided to her nephew in town that she had never seen the sisters eat. Meals were prepared and left outside their chamber doors. Yet when she returned in the morning, the dishes remained untouched, though the sisters' candlelight still flickered late into the night. The stable boy whispered that the horses grew restless whenever the sisters walked near the stables, ears pinned back, eyes rolling with fear. The maids claimed that they often heard Eleanor chanting softly in a language they did not recognize, while Margaret wept silently in the darkened halls. Then, one by one, the servants disappeared. The stable boy was the first. He left no belongings, no farewell, only the faint trail of blood on the stones near the cellar doors. The sisters explained his absence by saying he had stolen money and fled, but his family knew he would never have run without word. Days later, one of the maids vanished. The other swore she had heard muffled screams during the night, followed by heavy dragging sounds on the floor above her room. In the morning, the sisters dismissed her fears with cold smiles, telling her she must have dreamed it. Within a fortnight, she too was gone. Hester, the cook, lasted the longest. She continued her work, pale and trembling, until one night a farmer swore he saw her at the manor window pounding desperately against the glass, her mouth opening in a scream that made no sound. By morning she was gone, and the sisters told the villagers that she had been dismissed for disobedience. None dared question them further. The townsfolk grew restless. Families of the missing demanded answers, but the sisters only offered silence. They burned heaps of fabric in the gardens, servants' uniforms among them, the flames rising high against the darkened sky. A shepherd watching from afar swore he saw something else thrown into the fire. Bones, blackened and brittle, crumbling in the blaze. Though fear gnawed at their hearts, no villager dared enter the estate to search for the truth. The silence surrounding the sisters had grown heavier, like a warning. Even the bravest men of Blackwood kept their distance, muttering prayers when they passed the manor gates. The Cunningham sisters no longer lived as part of the village. They had become something apart, something feared. Their servants had not abandoned them. They had been taken. And though no one spoke it aloud, every soul in Blackwood knew the manor was feeding again. The disappearances of the servants should have been enough to rouse the village to action. Yet fear is a cruel silencer, and the people of Blackwood chose whispers over confrontation. What no villager realized was that within the cold halls of the Cunningham Manor, the sisters had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. It was Eleanor who guided their steps. She had read every line of their ancestors' journals, traced every symbol inked in the margins, and committed every forbidden phrase to memory. She believed she understood the covenant fully. The price of preservation was blood, not metaphorical, but literal. The offering had to be taken with purpose, and it had to be accepted. "Our family endures only when others are given," she told Margaret, her eyes burning with conviction. "This is the duty we have inherited. Without it, we will wither as mother and father did." Margaret trembled at her sister's words, torn between horror and loyalty. She did not possess Eleanor's iron will, but she was bound by the strength of their sisterhood, by the unshakable belief that Eleanor could not be wrong. And so, when the first ritual was performed, Margaret stood at her sister's side. The ritual chamber was the cellar, the place their father had forbidden them to enter. Now, by the light of dozens of candles, its purpose became clear. Symbols carved into the stone walls glistened with fresh blood. A heavy altar of blackened oak stood in the center, stained from years of hidden use. The air smelled of iron and decay, as though the very stones had absorbed centuries of death. The first offering had been the stable boy. Eleanor's voice was steady as she spoke the words from the journal, her hands coated crimson. Margaret wept silently, clutching the boy's locket, a token Eleanor demanded she place on the altar. When the chanting ended, the candles flickered, red violently, and a wind seemed to rush through the sealed cellar. Eleanor's face glowed with unnatural vitality, her cheeks flush, her eyes bright with a terrible light. Margaret, though trembling, felt her own body lighten, her fevered coughs fading as though erased. After that night, there was no turning back. Each disappearance became a necessity, each ritual another stone laid in the path they could not escape. Eleanor insisted it was not cruelty, but survival, that the covenant demanded it, and that it was better to offer strangers than to let the Cunningham line be extinguished. Margaret said little, but she obeyed, her hands shaking as she lit the candles, as she scrubbed the blood from the stone floor when it was done. The sisters sealed their pact not with words, but with silence. They never spoke of the rituals beyond the cellar, never acknowledged the screams that sometimes lingered in their ears long after. Outwardly, they appeared calm, pale and untouchable. Inwardly, they carried the weight of their covenant, a pact of blood binding them tighter than flesh, tighter than family. And the manor, once a house of mourning, became something else entirely, a shrine to their inheritance, where life itself was currency and death was merely the price of survival. Though the manor stood in silence, the cellar beneath it whispered of horrors that no villager dared imagine. For generations, the Cunningham family had guarded it fiercely, never allowing even their closest servants to pass its iron door. To the world above, it was nothing more than a storage chamber for wine and grain. But those who lived closest to the estate claimed otherwise. They said the earth itself seemed to moan at night, as though the ground beneath the manor was not holding barrels, but secrets. By 1830, the cellar had become the sisters' sanctuary. It was there that Eleanor drew her sigils, where she sharpened her ritual knife and kept her journals of blood. Margaret, pale and hollow-eyed, often lingered by the door, her hands trembling on the rusted handle, torn between running from the place and obeying her sister's command to enter. The air inside was always heavy, thick with the metallic scent of iron. Even the stone steps seemed to groan beneath their feet, as if burdened by the weight of what had been done there. The villagers began to notice changes. Farmers working the outer fields swore they heard strange thudding sounds from deep underground, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, or like something striking against stone. Shepherd boys claimed that, when the wind shifted, they could hear faint cries drifting up from the hill, muffled but unmistakable. And yet, whenever anyone grew bold enough to speak of it, others would hush them. No one wanted to be the one to draw the sisters' gaze. Still, rumors multiplied. It was said that the cellar walls were lined not with shelves of wine, but with shelves of bones, arranged neatly, stacked with the care of a collector. Some whispered that the sisters kept the bodies preserved, suspended in a state between death and decay, their faces twisted in eternal silence. Others said the cellar itself was cursed ground, that the earth had been fed too much blood, and now it was alive, swallowing all who entered. The final confirmation came one bitter winter night. A peddler, half-drunk and reckless, boasted in the tavern that he would sneak into the estate to prove the villagers cowards. He was last seen stumbling toward the manor with a lantern. By morning, only the lantern was found, extinguished, bent, and lying before the locked cellar door. From that day forward, no one doubted that the cellar held more than shadows. It became a place of dread in the villagers' minds, a door that should never be opened. Parents warned their children never to set foot on Cunningham Hill, for even the ground there seemed to hunger. Inside the manor, the sisters continued their work. Eleanor thrived, her beauty growing sharper, her youth unnaturally preserved. Margaret withered, guilt hollowing her, but still she obeyed. And the cellar, always locked, always guarded, became the heart of their deadly secret, pulsing quietly beneath the stones of Blackwood like a buried disease waiting to spread. By the autumn of 1830, the people of Blackwood had learned to live with their fear. The manor loomed above them like a silent judge, its windows dark and watchful, yet no villager dared set foot beyond its gates. The disappearances had slowed, or perhaps the sisters had simply grown more careful. Either way, the town returned to its uneasy rhythm, whispering prayers when the wind carried screams from the hill, pretending not to see the flickering lights that burned until dawn. But fear is not shared by all men. Outsiders, untouched by the village's history and superstitions, often dismissed such tales as ignorant folklore. And so it was with Dr. Alistair Whitcomb, a travelling scholar of unnatural sciences who arrived in Blackwood that autumn. He was a tall, gaunt man in his late 30s, with ink-stained fingers and a journal always tucked beneath his arm. His fascination lay not with crops or trade, but with the unexplained, the occult, the forgotten rites whispered in rural corners of the world. Blackwood, with its rumours of cursed sisters and vanishing souls, was exactly the kind of place he sought. From the moment he stepped into the tavern, the villagers warned him away. "Keep your distance from Cunningham Hill," the innkeeper muttered as he poured the stranger a mug of ale. "Those sisters aren't natural. You'll not find study there, only death." But Whitcomb only smiled, his curiosity sharpened by every caution. "Death," he replied, "is the purest truth of all." For several nights, he lodged in a small room overlooking the hill. By lamplight, he recorded what he observed, the patterns of the sisters' candlelight, the strange shadows that moved within the manor's windows, the sudden stillness of animals whenever they drew near the estate. On one particularly windless night, he claimed he heard a chorus of voices from beneath the earth, low, drawn out, and mournful, like a chant repeated by those long dead. Driven by his obsession, Whitcomb began to sketch maps of the estate's grounds, noting every path, every crumbling wall, every vantage point from which he could watch unseen. He questioned the villagers, though most refused to speak. Only the oldest among them whispered fragments of the Cunningham legacy, their eyes darting toward the manor with each word. He learned of the cellar, of the disappearances, of the firelight that consumed more than clothing. Still, he was not deterred. If anything, the danger seemed to compel him further. "If such rituals exist," he wrote in his journal, "then the Cunningham sisters are not merely women. They are the final custodians of an ancient covenant. Their secrets may be horrific, but they are truth, and truth must be preserved." What Whitcomb did not yet understand was that truth, in Blackwood, had always demanded blood, and the sisters, watching from their high windows, had already noticed the stranger who lingered too long on the edges of their silence. The arrival of Dr. Alistair Whitcomb unsettled the balance that had kept Blackwood in its uneasy silence. The sisters had tolerated the villagers' whispers, for fear was a useful veil. But Whitcomb was different. He was not afraid. He lingered too close to the gates, studied the manor with obsessive care, and scribbled notes under the light of his lamp when others dared not even look toward the hill. Eleanor, watching from the tall windows, understood what such boldness meant. He would eventually try to enter. It was Margaret who first voiced concern. "Sister, he sees too much," she whispered one evening, as the two of them stood in the cellar, their ritual candles burning low. Eleanor's reply was cold, almost pleased. "Then let him. The covenant requires offering still." The night of fire came without warning. A storm raged above Blackwood, thunder cracking across the sky, lightning splitting the clouds in violent flashes. Villagers huddled inside their homes, but Whitcomb, ever the seeker, chose that night to act. Lantern in hand, journal pressed to his chest, he climbed the hill toward the manor gates. Some claimed they saw him from the village below, his light weaving like a restless spirit across the rain-slick path. What happened inside can never be fully known, but fragments of the truth were pieced together from what the villagers witnessed and what Whitcomb's burned journal later revealed. He entered through a side door, long unused, and made his way into the depths of the manor. There, in the cellar, he found what he had sought. Walls etched with symbols, bones arranged with dreadful precision, and the sisters themselves, their faces illuminated by a circle of flame. The villagers swore they heard his voice crying out, a mix of horror and triumph, followed by the unearthly wail of the sisters' chant. Then, suddenly, fire erupted. Whether Whitcomb saked it himself in desperate defiance, or whether the sisters unleashed it as part of their ritual, no one could say. But the flames climbed swiftly, devouring the old timbers of the manor. Windows burst outward in showers of sparks. The roof collapsed with a roar. The people of Blackwood rushed to the foot of the hill, powerless to intervene. They watched as the estate burned, the storm above lashing it with wind and rain, yet unable to quench the inferno. From within the blaze came sounds that would never be forgotten, screams that did not sound entirely human, rising and twisting until they echoed like the cries of 100 souls at once. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voices ceased. The fire consumed itself, leaving the manor a blackened shell, its stone walls standing but hollow, its windows empty eyes staring into the night. No bodies were found. Not Whitcomb's, not Eleanor's, not Margaret's. Only charred fragments of bone lay scattered in the ashes, too few and too small to account for all who had vanished there. The villagers hoped the fire had ended the curse, but the silence that followed felt heavier than ever, as if the manor's secrets had not died, but been loosed upon the earth. When dawn broke over Blackwood, smoke still curled from the ruins of the Cunningham Manor. The storm had passed, leaving the hill shrouded in mist, its once proud estate reduced to blackened stone and smouldering ash. The villagers gathered at a distance, hesitant to climb the path. For years they had feared what lay inside that house. Now its walls had been torn open by fire, and the truth could no longer be ignored. At last, a small group of men, armed with lanterns and trembling resolve, ventured into the ruins. They stepped over scorched beams and shattered glass, the air still thick with the acrid stench of burning flesh. The upper floors had collapsed entirely, but the cellar remained intact, its heavy iron door warped by heat, yet still sealed shut. The men hesitated, glancing at one another, none eager to touch it. Then one, braver than the rest, raised a hammer and struck the hinges until the rusted metal gave way. The door groaned open. What lay beyond chilled even the most hardened among them. The cellar was not a place of storage, as the villagers had long believed, but a shrine to something unspeakable. The stone walls were etched with strange markings, their grooves filled with blackened residue that looked too much like blood. At the center stood a massive altar, its surface scorched, but unmistakably stained with years of sacrifice. Around it, arranged in eerie order, were bones, dozens upon dozens of them. Some were ancient, brittle with age, while others still bore the sickly white sheen of recent death. Skulls lined the shelves like grotesque trophies, hollow eyes staring out at the intruders. But it was not only bones they found. In one corner, hidden beneath a fallen beam, they uncovered something worse, the remains of bodies that had not yet decayed. These corpses, bound by iron chains, seemed to have been preserved, their flesh waxen and stiff, as though trapped in some unnatural slumber. Their faces were twisted in silent screams, their hands outstretched as if clawing for escape. Among them, a scrap of charred fabric bore the insignia of a servant's apron. Another, a half-burnt locket, engraved with initials that matched the missing stable boy. There was no mistaking it. The villagers' vanished kin had not fled, as the sisters once claimed. They had been consumed one by one to feed a covenant older than any living soul could recall. The men staggered back in horror, retching from the sight. Some fled the cellar altogether, unwilling to breathe its poisoned air another moment. Others remained, transfixed by the altar's terrible presence, the realization that every whispered rumor had been true, and worse than true. The cellar revealed the heart of the Cunningham legacy, not wealth, not prestige, but blood. The sisters' secret lay exposed at last, yet the question lingered like smoke in the ruined air. Where were Eleanor and Margaret? For though the cellar bore proof of their crimes, their bodies were nowhere to be found. The ruins of the Cunningham Manor never truly cooled. For weeks after the fire, smoke seeped from the blackened stones as though the earth itself continued to smoulder. The villagers of Blackwood avoided the hill entirely, unwilling to climb the path that had once led to splendor and now led only to dread. Those who had entered the cellar could not rid themselves of what they had seen. The bones, the preserved corpses, the altar, scorched but unbroken. It was proof of everything they had feared, and yet it offered no closure. For Eleanor and Margaret Cunningham had not been found. Not in the ashes, not in the cellar, not among the bones of the dead. Their absence gnawed at the village like a wound that would not heal. Some clung to the hope that the fire had consumed them utterly, their ashes scattered among the ruins. Others whispered that the sisters had walked away unscathed, carried by the very forces they had served. The weeks turned into months, and still the stories spread. Shepherds claimed they saw two figures drifting along the edges of the forest at night, pale as moonlight, their gowns untouched by soil or flame. Travelers passing through spoke of women with piercing eyes who appeared at the roadside and vanished when approached. Children swore they heard laughter carried on the wind when they strayed too near the hill. But the most chilling tale came from a gravedigger who worked the churchyard on a bitter winter evening. He swore that as he lowered a coffin into the earth, he looked up to see two women watching him from the shadows. Their faces were beautiful, yet lifeless, their skin smooth as porcelain, their eyes unblinking. He dropped his lantern and fled, vowing never to return after dark. The villagers began to call it the curse of Blackwood. The fire had not cleansed the evil from their land. It had freed it. The manor stood as a husk. But the Cunningham sisters' presence lingered. Whether spirits, witches, or something beyond human understanding, no one dared decide. It was enough to know that on certain nights, when the moon vanished and the forest fell silent, Blackwood did not belong to the living. Generations later, the ruins still stand. The cellar remains, its stones blackened, but its markings still visible, as though untouched by time. Those who have dared to descend claim the air grows colder with each step, and that faint voices murmur just beyond hearing. Few remain long enough to test the truth. And so, the tale of the Cunningham sisters endures. Two women bound by blood and by covenant, their secret written not in ink, but in the bones of those who vanished. They are gone, yet not gone, silent, yet watching. The fire destroyed their home, but not their hunger. In Blackwood, the curse is not a story, it is a presence. And on nights when the wind carries their laughter, the villagers still shudder, for they know the Cunningham sisters' deadly secret did not die in 1830.